The call came on a quiet Tuesday morning. Two sentences from a neighbor changed everything. "Jake, I'm sorry. Your father passed away last night." For a long moment, Jake Wilson simply held the phone to his ear and stared out the window of his small apartment in Dallas. Traffic moved below him. People crossed the street. The world continued exactly as it had 5 minutes earlier. But something in Jake's world had just stopped. His father, David Wilson, had always been there. Not loud, not dramatic, just there. And now he wasn't. Jake grew up in a small town called Brookhaven, Texas, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and nothing seemed to change for decades. Their house sat on a quiet street lined with old oak trees. It wasn't big or fancy, but it had a wide backyard and a small wooden shed tucked behind a row of bushes. The shed was old even when Jake was a kid. The paint had faded to a dull gray, and the roof sagged slightly in the middle. But the most interesting thing about the shed was simple. It was always locked. Every single day of Jake's childhood, that door stayed shut, and the key was always in his father's pocket. When Jake was 6 years old, curiosity finally got the better of him. "Dad," he asked one afternoon while they were playing catch in the yard, "what's in the shed?" David Wilson caught the baseball, rubbed the dirt off it with his thumb, and tossed it back. "Just some old stuff," he said calmly. Jake frowned. "Then why is it always locked?" His father paused for a moment before answering. "Because some things don't need to be bothered with." That answer only made Jake more curious. Over the years, he asked again and again. Sometimes when his dad was fixing something in the kitchen, sometimes when they were mowing the lawn together, the answer never changed. "Don't worry about the shed, Jake." Eventually, Jake stopped asking. Kids grow up. New interests replace old mysteries. School, friends, sports, and dreams of leaving a small town behind. The locked shed slowly became just another normal part of the backyard, like the oak tree, like the old fence, like the quiet life his father lived. David Wilson worked as a mechanic at a small auto repair shop on Main Street. He woke up early every morning, drank black coffee from the same chipped mug, and drove his old pickup truck to work. He wasn't the kind of father who gave long speeches or emotional advice. Instead, he showed things through actions. If Jake's bike chain slipped, his father fixed it without complaint. If the porch light stopped working, he replaced it before dinner. He believed problems were meant to be solved quietly. Jake admired him, but as he got older, he also felt something else: restlessness. Brookhaven felt too small. When Jake graduated high school, he left for college in Austin. After that, he moved to Dallas for work. The distance between father and son didn't happen all at once. It happened slowly. Phone calls became shorter. Visits became less frequent. "Work's been busy, Dad," Jake would say. "Take care of yourself," David would reply. That was usually the end of the conversation. Years passed like that. Jake built a career in marketing. He worked long hours, climbed the ladder, moved into a modern apartment, and surrounded himself with people who talked about promotions, investments, and big plans. Brookhaven became something he only thought about during holidays. And the shed? He hadn't thought about it in years. The drive back to Brookhaven took almost 4 hours. Jake hadn't made that drive in over 2 years. The town looked exactly the same. Same diner on the corner, same gas station, same quiet streets. Time seemed to move differently here. The Wilson house stood where it always had. The front porch looked a little older. The paint had peeled more than Jake remembered. But everything else was familiar. Jake stood in the doorway for a long moment before stepping inside. The house felt strangely quiet. His father's boots were still near the door. His coffee mug sat in the sink. It felt as if David Wilson had simply stepped outside and might return any minute, but Jake knew he wouldn't. The funeral was small. A few neighbors, some old co-workers from the repair shop. People shook Jake's hand and said kind things. Your dad was a good man. He helped a lot of people. He'll be missed. Jake nodded politely, but most of it blurred together. After the service, the house felt even emptier. Jake had come back with one practical goal: clean the house, sell it, move on. That's what people did. Life continued. The next few days were spent sorting through his father's belongings: old tools, work clothes, stacks of receipts. David Wilson had never been a man who kept many personal things. But one afternoon, while going through a drawer in the bedroom, Jake found something unexpected: a small metal key. It sat alone in the drawer beside an old notebook. Jake picked up the key and immediately recognized it, even after all these years. It was the shed key. For a moment, Jake just stared at it. A memory from childhood quietly resurfaced. Don't worry about the shed, Jake. He walked to the back door and stepped outside. The backyard looked smaller than he remembered. The oak tree was still there. The old wooden shed stood exactly where it always had. Still quiet, still closed, still holding its secret. Jake walked slowly across the grass. The door looked older now. The wood was worn and slightly cracked. He held the key in his hand, suddenly unsure why his heart was beating faster. Maybe because this mystery had lasted his entire life. Maybe because his father was gone. Maybe because some part of him felt like opening that door would change something he couldn't undo. He took a breath. Then he unlocked the door. The lock clicked softly. Jake pulled the door open. Dust floated in the sunlight. At first, he couldn't fully understand what he was seeing. The shed was much bigger inside than he expected. Shelves lined the walls, and on those shelves were dozens of things. Toys, old toy trucks, stuffed animals, wooden trains. But they weren't broken. They looked repaired, cleaned, carefully fixed. On the opposite side of the shed stood several bicycles, small ones, medium ones, each one freshly painted or repaired, chains oiled, tires inflated. Jake stepped inside slowly. His confusion deepened with every step. Why would his father keep all of this here? Then Jake noticed something else: the back wall. It was covered in photographs, dozens of them. Children smiling, holding toys, sitting on bicycles. Jake walked closer. Some of the photos looked decades old. Others were more recent. In every photo, a child held something that clearly came from this shed. And behind the camera, it had to be his father. Jake's chest tightened slightly. He turned and saw the small wooden workbench in the corner. Tools were neatly arranged above it: screwdrivers, wrenches, glue bottles, paint cans. On the bench sat the old notebook Jake had found in the drawer. He opened it slowly. The pages were filled with handwriting, dates, short notes. Repaired red bicycle, chain replaced. For Tommy, his mom said money's tight. Fixed train set, missing wheel replaced. For Lucas, stuffed bear cleaned and sewn, belonged to Emma. Jake turned another page, and another. The notebook went back years, dozens of entries, maybe hundreds. Some included little notes beside them. Dad working 2 jobs, didn't want the kid to go without. Birthday coming up. Bike found behind school, repaired and gave to Marcus. Jake sat down on the small stool beside the workbench. The quiet of the shed suddenly felt heavy. His father hadn't just been storing things here. He had been fixing them. For years. Maybe decades. Jake flipped further into the notebook. Toward the end, the handwriting had become slightly shakier, but the entries continued. Blue bike, brake cable replaced. For Sarah. Toy dinosaur repaired. Little boy very happy. The final page contained only one short sentence. Jake recognized the date. It was from 3 weeks ago. Another bike finished today. Good day. Jake closed the notebook slowly. And for the first time since the phone call, the full weight of everything settled in his chest. His father had never talked about any of this. Not once. All those years, Jake thought his father lived a simple, quiet life. Work, home, sleep. But every evening, David Wilson had been coming out here, fixing broken toys, repairing bicycles, helping kids whose families couldn't afford new ones. And he had never told anyone. Not the town, not Jake. Jake looked again at the wall of photographs, smiling faces. Children who probably never knew the full story either. To them, maybe it was just a kind man who gave them something when they needed it. Jake felt a deep ache of regret. How many times had he rushed through phone calls with his father? How many visits had he skipped because he was too busy? All those years, his father had been quietly making the world better in the smallest possible way. And Jake had never noticed. The next morning, Jake didn't pack boxes. He went back to the shed. Sunlight streamed through the small, dusty window. The repaired toys still filled the shelves. Jake stood there for a long time. Then he noticed something behind the workbench. A small pile of things waiting to be fixed. A toy fire truck with a missing ladder, a bicycle with a bent wheel, a stuffed rabbit with torn stitching. They were unfinished projects, his father's last ones. Jake walked to the workbench and sat down. He picked up the toy fire truck and examined it carefully. The ladder had simply come loose. He looked up at the tools hanging on the wall. For a moment, he almost laughed quietly. His father had taught him basic repair skills years ago, fixing bikes, tightening bolts, small practical things. Jake reached for a screwdriver. The metal felt cool in his hand. He carefully tightened the small screws holding the ladder. It took less than 5 minutes. When he finished, the toy looked whole again. Jake placed it gently on the shelf beside the others. A strange calm settled over him. He reached for the bicycle next. This repair would take longer. But for the first time in a long time, Jake wasn't thinking about work or emails or deadlines. He was simply fixing something, just like his father had done. A few days later, Jake walked into the small diner on Main Street, the same one he had visited as a kid. A young mother sat at a table with her son nearby. The boy stared sadly at a broken toy truck in his hands. Jake hesitated for a moment. Then he walked over. "Mind if I take a look at that?" he asked. The boy shrugged. Jake examined the toy. Loose wheel. Simple fix. He smiled slightly. "I think I know someone who can repair this." The mother looked curious. "Really?" Jake nodded. "Yeah." He paused before adding quietly, "My dad used to help with things like this." He stood up. "If you don't mind, I'll bring it back tomorrow." The boy's face brightened. "Okay." Jake took the toy truck and stepped outside into the warm Texas afternoon. For the first time since returning to Brookhaven, the future didn't feel like something he needed to escape. The house would still be sold eventually. Life would still move forward. But some things were worth continuing. That evening, Jake unlocked the shed again. Sunlight faded slowly across the shelves of repaired toys. He placed the broken truck on the workbench. Then he opened his father's notebook. He turned to the final page. Under the last entry, Jake wrote something new. "Toy truck. Wheel repaired. For Daniel." He closed the notebook and looked around the quiet shed. For the first time, the mystery of the locked door was gone. In its place was something far more important, a simple tradition of kindness, one that didn't need attention or praise, just quiet hands and a willingness to help. Jake picked up the screwdriver and began the repair. And somewhere in the quiet of that small wooden shed in Brookhaven, Texas, his father's work continued. The truth was simple. His father had never needed the world to notice. Kindness to David Wilson had never been a performance. It had been a habit, quiet, steady, and patient. The same way he drank his morning coffee, the same way he fixed engines at the shop, the same way he had once fixed Jake's bicycle chain on a warm summer evening without saying a word. Jake sat alone in the shed as the evening light slowly dimmed through the dusty window. For years, he had believed success meant moving forward, bigger cities, bigger jobs, bigger plans. He had chased that idea so far that he never realized something small and meaningful had been happening right behind his childhood home. Not fame, not recognition, just repaired toys, working bicycles, smiling kids, and a man who never once thought to call it important. Jake closed the notebook and ran his fingers slowly across the worn wooden workbench. Every scratch and dent in the surface told a quiet story of patience. For the first time in his life, he understood something about his father that had never been spoken out loud. David Wilson had lived a life that left fingerprints on other people's happiness, and he had done it without ever asking for anything in return. The following weeks passed differently than Jake had expected. He still sorted through the house, he still made phone calls, but every evening, as the sun dipped behind the oak trees, he walked back to the shed. At first, he finished the projects his father had left behind: the bent bicycle wheel, the torn stuffed rabbit, the broken fire truck. Each time he repaired something, he added a small note in the notebook, short, simple, just like his father had done. Word spread quietly around Brookhaven. A mother mentioned it to another parent. A neighbor remembered the shed. Soon, small things began appearing near the back fence. A tricycle with a missing pedal, a puzzle with broken pieces, a skateboard with loose wheels. No one knocked on the door. They simply left the items there. And every evening, Jake carried them inside the shed. One night, several months later, Jake stepped outside after finishing a repair. The air was cool. The sky above Brookhaven was wide and full of stars. As he walked toward the house, he noticed something near the gate. A small boy stood there, holding his mother's hand. Jake recognized him. Daniel, the boy from the diner. The toy truck he'd fixed was tucked proudly under the boy's arm. "Hi," the boy said shyly. Jake smiled. "Hey there." The boy hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "My mom said you're the one who fixes things." Jake looked at the truck in the boy's hands. "I try." The boy lifted the toy slightly. "You made it better." Jake felt something tighten gently in his chest. Before he could respond, the boy added something else. "My mom says your dad used to do that too." Jake glanced toward the shed standing quietly in the backyard. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he nodded. "Yeah," Jake said softly. "He did." The boy smiled. Then he waved and walked away with his mother down the quiet street. Jake stood there watching them until they disappeared beneath the oak trees. The night was peaceful. Crickets hummed softly in the grass. Behind him, the shed door creaked slightly in the breeze. Jake turned back and walked inside one more time. The shelves were fuller now than they had been months ago, but the workbench looked the same. The notebook rested exactly where it always had. Jake opened it again. Page after page of small acts, years of quiet kindness written in simple ink. He turned to the very last page and picked up a pen. For a moment, he thought about everything he had once believed success looked like. Then, he wrote a single new line beneath his last entry. "Another toy repaired today. Good day." Jake closed the notebook and placed it gently on the bench. The shed grew quiet again. But this time, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt alive. Because somewhere in that small wooden shed, surrounded by repaired toys and second chances, one simple truth had finally become clear. A man's life isn't measured by how loudly the world remembers him. It's measured by how many smiles he quietly leaves behind. And in Brookhaven, Texas, David Wilson was still making children smile.